It all started with a simple idea. The kind of idea that comes only after years of carrying scars no one else can see. A daughter looked at her mother, the one person who had always held her world together, and asked herself, what has she ever truly had for herself? The answer was heartbreaking. Her mother had never had a space of her own. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not as an adult. Never once did she close the door on a bedroom that belonged only to her. And that's when the daughter decided she would give her the gift she never had. A real sanctuary. A bedroom filled with peace, dignity, and the promise of a fresh start. But to understand why this mattered so deeply, we have to go back to the beginning. From the time she was little, Elena Ramirez knew that home was never guaranteed. One month they'd be sleeping in a rented room above a stranger's garage. The next, they'd be in a shelter, waiting in line for a thin mattress under buzzing fluorescent lights. Sometimes it was just the back seat of a car that doubled as a bedroom. Elena's mother, Marisol, did everything she could to hold their world together. She worked long hours in jobs that barely paid enough to cover groceries. Cleaning offices, working in fast food, picking up any shift no one else wanted. But no matter how hard she pushed, the ground beneath them always seemed to crack. Elena remembers nights lying awake on a cot in a shelter, listening to other children cry themselves to sleep. The air smelled like bleach and sweat. She would press her face into her mother's side just to feel safe for a few hours. I grew up never knowing if the roof over my head would still be there tomorrow, she would later say. But Marisol, despite her exhaustion, always found a way to be strong in front of her daughter. She'd whisper, "Mija, everything will be okay. We're together, and that's what matters." Those words became Elena's anchor, the one thing that steadied her in the chaos. Marisol's own story was filled with sacrifice. When she was just 16, her father fell gravely ill. Someone needed to step in and take care of her younger siblings. Without hesitation, she dropped out of school and shouldered the responsibility. It meant her dreams ended before they even began. English was her second language, and doors didn't open easily for her. Most of the time she was underestimated, dismissed, or forced into jobs no one else wanted. But she never complained. She fought to keep her family afloat, sometimes working at fast food counters, sometimes scrubbing bathrooms, sometimes taking double shifts that left her with aching feet and no rest. Elena remembers watching her mother's hands, cracked, dry, always moving, cooking, folding clothes, packing their belongings yet again when rent was too high. That quiet resilience became the fire that carried Elena forward. Still, there was always an undercurrent of fear. Elena described it as waiting for the other shoe to drop. Even in the rare moments when they managed to stay in one place for a few months, she knew it wouldn't last. The eviction notice would come, or the rent would rise, or her mother would lose another job. Stability was a dream just out of reach. One summer, they packed everything they owned into 2 duffel bags and moved across the state to Florida. They hoped extended relatives could help them. For a short while, it seemed like things might improve. But once again, the burden fell mostly on Marisol and her daughter. The rooms they could afford were cramped, dim, and often infested. They never felt like home. Only like pit stops on a never-ending road. Middle school was a turning point. That year, they lost their room again. With no savings and nowhere to go, Elena and her mother found themselves back in a shelter. But something inside Elena shifted. For the first time, she realized education could be her way out. She threw herself into her studies. When a teacher noticed her determination, they helped her apply for scholarships. Against all odds, she was accepted into a private school on a full scholarship. At first, it felt like a miracle, But it also came with its own challenges. Every day, Elena walked through hallways filled with students who seemed to have everything. Expensive clothes, shiny cars waiting to pick them up, vacations in the summer. Meanwhile, she wore hand-me-down uniforms and quietly hid the truth that at night, she returned not to a cozy bedroom, but to a shelter bed. She remembers avoiding conversations about weekends or holidays because the comparison cut too deep. She would smile, nod, and change the subject, all the while carrying the weight of insecurity. But rather than break her, those moments sharpened her resolve. She promised herself she would use this chance, however painful, to carve out a future where her mother would never again have to beg for stability. Elena's path wasn't easy. Late nights of studying while her mother worked shifts, morning bus rides across the city before the sun was up, moments of doubt when she questioned if she truly belonged in those classrooms. But she kept going. Every test, every assignment, every small success became proof that she could rewrite their story. When she graduated high school and later earned her degree in social work, it wasn't just a diploma she held in her hands. It was the first piece of stability her family had ever known. She was the first in her entire family to graduate college. That day, her mother cried harder than Elena had ever seen. Not tears of sadness, but of pride. Tears that carried decades of exhaustion finally lifted. Years later, Elena found herself with something she had only dreamed of: a steady job, an affordable apartment, and the ability to pay her bills on time. For the first time, she could buy groceries without counting every dollar. She could decorate her living room, light candles, and feel the peace of knowing no landlord was about to force them out. But more than anything, she could finally give back to the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. One evening, she stood in the doorway of her new apartment, looking at the empty master bedroom. And it hit her. My mother has never had a room of her own, not as a child, not as a teen, not even now. That realization broke her heart and inspired her. She decided the biggest room in the house wouldn't belong to her. It would belong to Marisol. She poured her love into every detail: soft linens, warm lighting, gentle colors that spoke of calm and renewal. She wanted her mother to walk in and feel, for the first time in her 60-plus years, that she had a sanctuary. When the day finally came to show her, Elena guided her mother down the hall. She opened the door slowly. Marisol froze. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled instantly in her eyes. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "Is this mine?" Elena nodded, her own eyes wet. "Sí, Mama. This is yours. You deserve this and so much more." The reaction was overwhelming. Years of silent suffering, years of putting everyone else first. All of it poured out in her tears. She embraced her daughter tightly, both of them shaking with emotion. Elena later explained, "Growing up, I saw my mom give me everything she never had. But I also saw her suffer quietly. It made me realize, who takes care of her? She has carried everyone, but no one has carried her. I wanted to change that." For the first time, they lived together in a space they could truly call their home. Not a stopgap, not a rented corner. A real home filled with love and dignity. And as Elena looked at her mother resting peacefully in her new room, she knew that every struggle, every sleepless night, every moment of shame and fear had led to this. The gift wasn't just a bedroom. It was proof that the cycle had finally broken. And this is only the beginning of their journey. The night after Marisol first stepped into her new room, something remarkable happened. For the first time in her life, she slept without fear. No sudden noises from strangers in the next shelter bed. No stress of wondering if the rent was due. No nagging thought that tomorrow they might be forced to pack their bags again. She slept deeply, peacefully, and when she woke up, sunlight poured through the curtains Elena had carefully hung. She turned to her daughter, who was sitting quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Marisol's voice cracked as she said, "I never thought I'd see the day where I had a room of my own." That moment stayed with Elena, because this wasn't just about four walls and a bed. It was about dignity, about telling her mother, "You matter. Your sacrifices were not invisible." But the road to that moment had been long, painful, and filled with more setbacks than most people could survive. When Elena was just a child, she didn't know the words eviction notice. She only knew the sound of her mother's hurried voice telling her to pack what she could carry. Sometimes she'd leave her favorite toy behind because there was no room. Sometimes she'd leave her homework unfinished because they had to run. Each time she'd ask, "Mama, why do we have to go?" And each time, Marisol would say the same thing, "Because we have to keep moving forward." It wasn't until Elena grew older that she realized what those words truly meant. They weren't just about moving houses, they were about survival. Middle school was the hardest. Elena remembers sitting in class with her stomach growling, too embarrassed to tell anyone she hadn't eaten breakfast. At lunch, she'd sit alone, slowly chewing a free meal provided by the school while other kids opened lunchboxes packed with snacks she couldn't even dream of affording. It wasn't just hunger, it was the feeling of being different. She'd overhear classmates talking about their weekend trips to the beach, their birthday parties, their family vacations. She'd smile politely, nodding as if she understood, but inside she felt like she lived on a different planet. One day, a teacher pulled her aside. She said she'd noticed Elena's sharp mind, her drive, her potential. She encouraged her to apply for a scholarship to a private school in Boca Raton. At first, Elena thought it was impossible. Kids like her didn't belong in places like that. But somehow, against all odds, she got in. Walking into that new school was like stepping into another universe. Shiny cars lined the parking lot. Students wore designer clothes, carried the newest phones, and talked about their family vacations to Europe. Elena wore the same hand-me-down uniform, ironed carefully by her mother. She carried a backpack stitched together at the seams. And she hid the truth. That at night she went home not to a cozy house, but to a shelter where her only privacy was a thin curtain separating cots. She became an expert at pretending. Pretending she'd had a normal weekend. Pretending she wasn't ashamed of the smell of her thrift store shoes. Pretending she wasn't terrified someone would discover her secret. But deep down, Elena was burning with determination. Every book she opened, every essay she wrote, every test she passed was a silent promise. One day, I'll build a different life for us. That promise became harder to keep as the years went on. Her mother's health began to falter under the weight of endless labor. Her back ached from long hours. Her hands were raw from cleaning. There were nights she could barely walk through the door, but she always forced a smile for her daughter. Elena watched it all with a heavy heart. She wanted to help, to ease her mother's pain, but all she could do was study harder, hoping her future success would make the sacrifices worth it. She remembers one particular night vividly. The power had been shut off in the tiny room they were renting because they couldn't pay the bill. The only light came from a small candle flickering on the windowsill. Elena sat at the table, bent over her textbooks, while her mother lay on the couch, whispering encouragement even through her exhaustion. That night, Elena swore silently to herself, "I will not let this be the end of our story." College was another mountain. Elena applied everywhere, terrified she wouldn't be accepted. But when the letter from Florida Atlantic University came, with the words, "You've been admitted," she and her mother cried together, clutching the paper as though it was a ticket to freedom. University life was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time, Elena felt she had one foot in a different world, a world where stability was possible. But she also carried her past like a shadow. She worked part-time jobs, studied late into the night, and constantly worried that one mistake could send her back to the life she'd fought so hard to escape. Graduating with a degree in social work was a triumph that words could barely capture. She wasn't just the first in her family to graduate college. She was proof that their suffering hadn't been in vain. Her mother's tears on graduation day were like a floodgate breaking. Tears of pride, tears of relief, tears of a lifetime's worth of sacrifices finally paying off. When Elena started working for a nonprofit dedicated to helping people in poverty, she felt an instant connection. It wasn't just a job, it was her calling. She understood the fear, the shame, the hunger because she had lived it, and now she could help others through it. Each day she went to work, she thought of her mother, of the long nights, the endless moves, the quiet resilience, and she reminded herself, this is why I do what I do. But even with her career taking off, even with stability slowly settling into her life, she never forgot one haunting truth. Her mother had never had a place of her own. And so, in their small Florida apartment, Elena made her plan. She saved money. She decorated carefully. She poured her heart into transforming the master bedroom into something beautiful. Every item she chose carried meaning. A soft comforter, because her mother had spent too many nights shivering. A sturdy dresser, because she had spent too long living out of bags. A lamp that cast a warm, golden glow, because she had studied by candlelight for far too many years. It wasn't just a bedroom. It was a lifetime of love stitched together. The night Marisol saw the room for the first time, she wept as though decades of weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She walked slowly across the room, touching the walls, running her fingers across the blanket, looking around as if she couldn't believe it was real. Then she turned to her daughter and whispered, "No one has ever done something like this for me." Elena held her mother tightly and replied, "It's about time someone did." That was the night everything changed. Because for the first time, both mother and daughter knew they weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And as Marisol drifted to sleep in her own bed, Elena sat quietly in the hallway, tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the past that had shaped her. Gratitude for the future she could now build. And above all, gratitude for the chance to finally give back to the woman who had given her everything. But little did they know, life still had more trials, more challenges, and more lessons waiting for them just around the corner. Life finally seemed to settle into something close to normal. For the first time, Elena and her mother weren't running. They had an address they could memorize, keys they could call their own. And every evening, they shared meals in a space that actually felt like home. But with stability came new fears. Because after so many years of instability, peace almost felt foreign. Elena would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, expecting to hear the sound of a landlord pounding on the door, or a shelter staff member telling them their time was up. Sometimes she'd quietly check on her mother, peeking into the master bedroom just to make sure she was still there, sleeping peacefully. And each time, she'd whisper to herself, "This is real. We made it." But even in this new chapter, challenges arose. Bills stacked up. Groceries weren't cheap. The pressure of maintaining stability weighed on Elena's shoulders. She worked long hours at her nonprofit job, pouring her heart into helping strangers, while silently fighting the fear of slipping back into old patterns. Her mother noticed. One evening, as Elena sat at the table with papers scattered everywhere, Marisol gently placed her hand on her daughter's and said, "You've already given me more than I ever dreamed of. Don't carry the world on your shoulders alone." Elena smiled faintly but didn't answer, because deep inside, she knew she wasn't just fighting for her present. She was fighting for a future where her mother never had to worry again. And that's what drove her to keep going. At work, she threw herself into every project. She met families who reminded her so much of her own past. Children who whispered about hunger. Mothers who held back tears while pretending to be strong. Every time she saw them, she thought, that was us. That could have been us forever. It fueled her determination. It made her fight harder. But it also reopened old wounds she thought she had buried. One day, after visiting a family in desperate need, she came home and collapsed into her mother's arms. Through tears, she whispered, "I don't know how you did it for so long. I don't know how you kept us alive when everything was against us." Her mother held her tightly, stroking her hair, and replied softly, "Because I had you. You were always my reason." Moments like that reminded Elena of the bond they shared, unbreakable, forged in struggle, and sealed with love. And hey, if you're watching this story right now, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more powerful stories like this one. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Because just when things seemed to finally be on the right track, a new storm began to form. Marisol's health, which had always been fragile from years of stress and hard labor, started to decline. At first, it was small: fatigue, headaches, moments of dizziness. But soon, it became harder to ignore. Elena found herself driving her mother to doctor appointments, holding her hand in waiting rooms, praying silently that the news wouldn't be devastating. Each time, she put on a brave face, but inside, she was terrified. She had built this life for her mother, but what if she couldn't keep her safe? One night, after a particularly worrying appointment, Elena sat alone in the living room. The apartment was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock. She stared at the closed bedroom door where her mother was resting, and she felt the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of fear they had endured. For the first time in a long time, she questioned everything. Had she done enough? Was it too late to give her mother the peace she deserved? Her thoughts spiraled until she whispered aloud, "Please, just let me have more time with her." But life wasn't only about loss and fear, because even in the midst of uncertainty, there were moments of joy. They decorated their apartment together, laughing as they hung pictures slightly crooked on the wall. They cooked meals side by side, experimenting with recipes neither of them had ever tried before. For Marisol, even something as simple as sipping tea in her own bedroom felt like a miracle. And for Elena, hearing her mother's laughter echo through their home was worth every battle she had ever fought. But still, the shadow of the unknown loomed. Elena knew that their journey wasn't over, that even after all the storms they had weathered, life could still throw more at them. And deep down, she feared the greatest trial was still ahead. As she tucked her mother into bed one evening, Marisol took her daughter's hand and said softly, "No matter what happens, promise me you'll keep living. Promise me you'll keep fighting." Elena nodded, holding back tears, her heart aching at the thought of what those words might mean. And that's where their story took yet another unexpected turn. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every day, Elena tried to juggle her job, the bills, and her mother's health. But the weight of it all pressed down harder with each passing moment. Her mother's symptoms worsened. The fatigue turned into sharp pains, the headaches into dizzy spells that left her clinging to walls for balance. Elena's heart clenched every time she saw it, because this was the woman who had carried her through hell and back, and now she was slipping. Doctor visits became more frequent. Tests piled up, and then, one evening, the phone rang. Elena answered, her hands trembling as the doctor's voice came through. He spoke calmly, carefully, but the words still hit her like a tidal wave. Marisol had a serious condition that required treatment. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be cheap. Elena sat frozen, the phone pressed to her ear, her world spinning. How could life be this cruel? After everything they had fought for, after finally building a home, after finally giving her mother the bedroom she had always deserved. Now this? That night, Elena cried quietly in her room, trying not to let her mother hear. She buried her face in her pillow, whispering prayers into the darkness. Please, don't take her away from me. Not now. Not when we've finally made it. The following morning, she forced a smile, cooking breakfast as if nothing had changed. But her mother knew. She always knew. Sitting across the table, Marisol reached for her daughter's hand and said, "We'll face this together." Like we always have? And in that moment, Elena realized something powerful. They weren't victims anymore. They were survivors, and they weren't about to give up now. Still, the battles weren't just medical. Money became tighter than ever. Insurance only covered part of the treatment, and Elena found herself drowning in paperwork, expenses, and sleepless nights. She took on extra shifts, cut back on meals, sacrificed every comfort she could, all to keep the lights on and her mother's treatment going. At work, she stayed strong, smiling for the families she served. But inside, she was burning out. And yet, through it all, Marisol never complained. Even on her worst days, she found ways to laugh, to comfort her daughter, to remind her that life still had beauty worth holding on to. One evening, Elena decided to surprise her mother with something special. She transformed the bedroom again, this time into a true sanctuary for healing. Soft lights, flowers by the window, and walls decorated with photos of their happiest memories. When Marisol walked in, her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "It's the most beautiful room I've ever had." And in that moment, Elena saw it. The spark of peace she had fought so hard to give her mother. But life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. Just as things seemed to stabilize, Elena received news that her job might face funding cuts. The nonprofit she had poured her soul into was struggling, and positions were at risk. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. Everything was hanging by a thread. Her mother's health, their home, their fragile peace. For the first time, Elena wondered if she could actually lose it all. And that's when she made a choice. She decided to tell her story, not just to friends, but to the world. She opened up about her past, about the nights in shelters, about the battles she and her mother had fought side by side. Her words carried weight. They touched people's hearts. And slowly, support began to trickle in. Friends, coworkers, even strangers reached out with encouragement, with help, with kindness. For the first time, Elena realized they weren't alone anymore. And hey, if you're watching this story right now, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing powerful stories of resilience and hope. And trust me, the final part of this journey is one you don't want to miss. Because as Elena and her mother stood at the edge of their hardest fight yet, something unexpected happened. Something that would change their story forever. And that's where we'll pick up in the final part. The days turned into weeks, and somehow Elena and her mother kept moving forward. Every appointment, every treatment, every bill, it was exhausting, but they faced it together. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, there were signs of hope. Marisol's strength began to return. The laughter in her voice grew louder, the light in her eyes brighter. Elena still carried the weight of responsibility, but now, for the first time in years, she also carried hope. One evening, they sat together on the balcony of their apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Her mother leaned back in her chair and whispered, This is the life I never thought I'd see." Elena's throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes, because she knew the journey had been brutal. But this moment, this peace, was worth every sleepless night. But life, as always, had one more twist. A letter arrived in the mail. It was from Elena's workplace. She opened it nervously, bracing herself for bad news. Instead, her hands trembled as she read. The nonprofit had secured new funding, and not only was her job safe, she was being promoted for her dedication and impact. It was as if the universe had finally rewarded her resilience. She rushed to tell her mother, who wrapped her arms around her and said, "See? The storm never lasts forever. The sun always finds its way back." And in that moment, Elena realized the truth. All the nights of hunger, all the shelters, all the moments of despair, they hadn't broken them. They had shaped them. They had prepared them for this very chapter of life. The transformation of their lives wasn't about wealth or luxury. It was about dignity, stability, love. The master bedroom Elena gave her mother was more than 4 walls and a bed. It was a symbol, a promise that no matter what life threw at them, they would rise. It was proof that cycles of hardship can be broken, that the past doesn't have to define the future. And perhaps most importantly, it was a reminder that honoring those who sacrificed everything for us is one of the greatest gifts we can ever give. As the story of Elena and Marisol comes to an end here, I want you to think about something. Who has been your rock? Who has carried you when you couldn't carry yourself? Sometimes we forget that our parents, our guardians, or the people who raised us, they're living their first life too. They make mistakes, they struggle, they break, and they get back up. And maybe the greatest honor we can give them is to say, "Now it's my turn to take care of you." If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience, love, and hope with the world. And trust me, the next story might just be the one you need to hear most. Elena once said, "If you keep going, one day you'll look back and realize it was worth it." And today, as she and her mother live in the home they once only dreamed of, those words have never rung truer. Because in the end, the storms don't define us. How we rise after them does. And that's the story of a daughter who gave her mother the bedroom and the life she never had.